it baffles me that this occurred at the home of his grandmother, which is apparently, I think, maybe like a couple blocks away from the school, and then he crashes into a ditch. There's so many moments in time prior to even getting to the school that it feels like officers should have been able to have apprehend him. Or am I wrong?
Yeah, I mean, it really it comes down to like their response time as well. I don't know enough about Uvalde to know like its kind of geographic makeup, but I believe the average like nationwide is anywhere from between 4 and 7 minutes of a response time. I mean, it really depends. Like if there was a police officer who was on patrol right by the school, then that would have made it even easier. I also believe there was a school resource officer at the school when this all went down, unless that has been a story that's changed as well.
I believe that it has, unfortunately. So the initial reporting was that yes, there was a resource officer on site that saw him, but that didn't engage. That was kind of the first little bit that we were told. But then I think that's where in this timeline they actually kind of retract that and change it, that there wasn't a resource officer on site.
I mean, even without that, I think if you look at 11:33, where it says he enters the school, and then 2 minutes later you see 3 police officers enter the school.
Yes.
Through the same door, and they're followed by 4 other officers. And then 2 minutes later, there's another 16 rounds. So it seems that even though that like they couldn't determine which room it was coming from, I mean, my understanding is it's not a very large school, so it's not spread out over a huge area. It's all enclosed. So, I mean, I feel like relatively it should be easy to figure out where it's coming from. And even if you only have 3 officers and you're waiting for more to show up, I mean, it's not ideal to split up and to just be single officers. But I mean, at that point, you have to make a command decision to just split up and try and find this person. And, once one officer found him, you could immediately radio everyone else and be like, hey, I found him, down this hallway, classroom, whatever. And, let them know. Because, I mean, it shows there, let's see, go towards the classroom. Oh, yeah, it says, where first 3 officers go toward the classroom, the gunman is with the door closed. And they're shot at and grazed. I mean, I don't want to say, luckily I've never gotten shot at. I've been around shootings and almost gotten into shootings with armed suspects. But I mean, if you're there and you know where the people are at, and it says there's 4 more officers that follow, it doesn't quite give a timeline. And then at 51, which is another almost 20 minutes later, more police officers arrive. And I think right there at 12:03, there's 19 inside the school. I mean, it's a really long time, but I mean, if we go with that, there was at least 7 officers in there just a minute or two after the gunman entered, and they got shot at, so they know where the classroom is, they know where it's coming from. I don't see why they wouldn't just go in.
Exactly.
Like I know you don't want to get shot. Like I get it. Like no one wants to get shot and die. But it kind of makes me wonder what their response like policy is. I know we always had like one of the ballistic shields in a patrol car, at least one of them. And usually there's several that'll have it. It really depends. But they easily could have made sure that someone got that. So that way, at least the first person through the door had that to take the rounds from the gunman, to allow the other ones more time to be able to shoot them. And I don't know if there was worry about potentially hitting, students. Obviously that is a concern and something you should be worried about. However, I will say, if the gunman's inside a classroom, there's only one entry to that classroom. And there's a bunch of students in there. And if he's already firing off rounds, my common sense would be that, You need to go in regardless of the risk of potentially you hitting a child. I know no one wants, that's kind of macabre in a way to say, if there's 19 students and 2 teachers, I mean, if all those students are in the same classroom, I mean, I don't want to say like the risk and reward of an officer potentially hitting a child is a benefit. But I mean, you have a gunman in there who, has a long gun, is firing off rounds. You're not entering the classroom because you got shot at and you keep hearing rounds going off. I mean, in my mind, I'd be thinking that is potentially one child after another.
Exactly.
Or teacher who is getting shot, and who knows if they're going to live. I mean, you have no idea where he's shooting them.
Exactly.
So, I mean, you have no idea how much time they have. If, he shot him in the leg, okay, they might have more time, but you don't know that.
And they were getting multiple calls from within the classroom. It was like room 112 and then also 111. One incident, I don't think it's listed in here, but there was one little girl that called 911 3 times, and it was because she could hear the officers that were like outside, and she was just like begging them to come in and to help, and they weren't doing anything. So, like in looking at this timeline, I'm just going to scroll back up for a second. This is at 11:27 kind of when all of this begins, and the officers by, a half an hour in still haven't done anything. But while the gunman has put himself into a classroom and is essentially shooting these kids. And like you said, it might be very macabre to say. But for me, I was like, if you guys are worried about the risk of children dying, then why aren't you taking some action? Because I'm not saying, children dying is a good thing. That's an awful thing. This should not have happened. But I think that the lives lost would have been seriously reduced, if not completely mitigated, had the officers acted more quickly. Because all other reports say that there were children with wounds that could have been saved, that they ultimately died because they bled out and they weren't, they didn't get the emergency response that they needed.
I mean, you have to remember too, for children, I mean, they don't have the same resiliency. So, you have, just because, an adult getting shot in the leg, as long as it doesn't, nick any arteries or anything, or shatter their femur, can relatively survive a decent amount of time, as long as they're not bleeding a lot. We know, obviously, if you got to look at a child's anatomy, very different. Obviously, they're much smaller. I mean, you just have to know that any shot can be fatal. I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's in the leg, the arm, or, like the torso. Anything can be fatal to a child getting shot at. And, I mean, I think the biggest thing for me here, just the timeline, I think it shows that when he entered the school, just 2 minutes later, at least 3 to 7 police officers enter. And just because they were getting shot at, I mean, that should be the key thing right there. Hey, we know what classroom he's in. Let's go in there. I think they're talking about how the on-scene commander made the call because there was a lull, which I don't even know why you would use that terminology in this scenario. I think he said a lull in the action, which hopefully maybe he just misspoke, but I don't have my hopes high. There's a very big difference between an active shooter and what I think he called it a barricaded subject. Typically, when you respond to these kind of things, if you have a barricaded subject, usually your first concern when you're responding is whether or not there's anyone else inside the residence or wherever this is occurring at, right? So you don't want to say it's a barricaded subject and be like, oh, by the way, there's also the person's whole family's in there.
Gotcha.
Because that changes your response. So if it's just like a barricaded subject, we would consider that, as I do, if there's one gunman and he's holed up and this saves residents. Or let's say he was in the school, but he was holed up in that classroom, but there's nobody in the classroom. Like they evacuated the school. Then once you know there's no threat to anyone else's life except the gunman and the officers, then you could call that a barricaded subject. But if he's still actively shooting, even if there's this quote unquote lull, as the DPS or whoever wanted to say it, there's still children in there. At the end of the day, there's still children. There's still a teacher or two who could have their lives ended by inaction. So I think the biggest takeaway I saw from that was they got there relatively quick, according to their timeline. He entered the school, and I think about just 2 minutes later, 3 to 7 officers are inside the school. They determine which classroom it's coming from. They get shot at. No one gets, wounded. It's just a graze. I wouldn't consider that wounded. That's, you can fight through that. So you still could have entered.
Yeah.
I mean, you at that moment have to understand that you may not come back. And that does suck. That's kind of, facing mortality is not something that anyone, really takes lightly. I think we all have that fear. But, like we were talking about before, you signed up to protect and serve people. And like that is like the epitome right there of being able to protect and serve someone in the community, is going into a classroom that you may get shot, you may get killed, but you're there trying to save children. I mean, I think it's a kind of standard thing. No one, I won't say anyone accepts murder, but anytime something happens to a kid, it's just elevated that much worse. I think as a society, we kind of have that visceral reaction of, you don't do anything to kids.
Yeah.
I'm not saying
in this.
Yeah, you're like, I'm not saying do anything to adults, but it's a little more understanding. Like people can kind of accept that more so than someone trying to go and do something terrible to a child. Because they're defenseless. There's no way that they could defend themselves in this situation.